Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman, and today we're going to discuss how to put work down when priorities change. So, change is constant. Uh, with the end of the quarter fast approaching, it's always a good time, or not always a good time, but it's a common time that managers reflect and say, hey, we're going to reprioritize things. And when things get reprioritized, you have to stop working on whatever you were working on, which means you have to put the work down. And there's two aspects of this. It's depending upon how you're working, putting the work down could be very problematic. Like you could be throwing away a lot of work,
Right.
or potentially. And then there's also just the mental shift of how to disengage from what you were doing. So let's talk about the how to put the work, like the work in progress down.
Okay.
So on this show, we talk about iterating and thesis shipping. We ship lots of small increments. And so when that happens, you shouldn't have much of a risk of lots of work in progress that if you just stopped, it would get lost. Like it wouldn't get merged. You wouldn't have this, oh my God, I've got 50, 60, 80 hours of work that I haven't merged. And now that I'm not going to finish, it's not going to get merged.
Right.
Maybe ever. Like by the time we get back to it, the code will have rotted and none of these changes will get in.
There are too many merge conflicts to
Right. Too many merge
reasonably
conflicts.
deal with.
And so the way to get around that is just work smaller. Just not just. But if you're thesis shipping, if you're always incrementally shipping, then you won't have 100 hours of work backed up on a single branch. You'll be like, oh, well, okay, if we're going to reprioritize, maybe I can get today's work in, maybe I can't, but it wouldn't be more than a day or two of work that doesn't get merged and isn't safe.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I feel like the only pushback to that is I generally find people work like I guess it depends on the feature that you're working on. If it's like a kind of a bigger feature, and you're using like a feature branch to work on that, and it kind of grows over time, versus merging things into main and using like a feature flag. That way you keep the PRs kind of small, and you already have everything flagged, so you don't have to really worry. So you could just keep merging like kind of unfinished code, but still behind a flag. That could affect that flow on just how small your PRs are kept. But if it's like a bigger feature, I could see it kind of creeping out into trying to get like everything in one branch before you're able to merge that back in.
Well, but that's where I would say you're doing it in a way that's not helpful to yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I'm writing new features, I'll usually feature flag it. But even if I'm not going to feature flag it, if it's new, then I wouldn't have any problem merging it, right? If I create a new data object that nothing else is using,
right?
Well, I could merge that, right? And I can get that in, and then it's in.
I like working that way personally, but yeah, I feel like I've had so many. So here's something I'm stuck on recently.
Okay.
These are some tidies, like remember the Kent Beck tidy first kind of thing.
I still have to read
that. So there's some cleanup stuff that I'm doing, and I'm intentionally working in small pieces, because if you do a bunch of cleanup PRs, I know this isn't feature related, but just bear with me for a second. If you do a bunch of cleanup PRs, after a while they can become really big, and then it looks like you're just gutting the whole system, right? And that could be a bit risky too, because you don't know what part of the thing, like the massive PR, the cleanup PR you did, broke the thing. So I like working in really small pieces, and then just getting one or two things that are like including a file that we no longer need. And like, I cleaned up some cron that had been disabled for 3 years. Okay, let's just clearly no, we're not turning it back on. Let me kill the cron line where it's disabled, and then kill the PHP scripts that was being run from cron. But then there's a bunch of reviewers who come back in and go, well, while we're here, but the thing that you deleted technically used 10 different AWS parameter store values. And since nothing else is using them now, we could also use this moment to clean up the parameter store values. And then
Mm-hmm.
once we clean up the parameter store values, it's actually another tangential piece of code over here that we can clean up. And they keep growing my PR for me. And I'm like, no, the point of this is to keep it small. But depending on the personality or the thoroughness or the of the reviewer, they almost push back to make you have a larger PR. And that's
That's
kind of a frustrating thing to communicate.
that's an interesting problem. I
Yeah.
usually I encounter that mindset, and what I usually do is I say, "Hey, that is a great idea. Let's approve this PR, and I promise that I will do a fast follow up with
Yeah.
that next piece, and we will just keep pulling it through. But I don't want this one to get so large that it becomes risky. Let's just
Right.
do it in an incremental fashion." And that's where, if you have social capital with these people, even if
Mm-hmm.
that's not how they like to work, but if they trust you that you say, "Hey, I'm going to do this, and I'll have the new one, that piece that you want tomorrow,"
Yeah.
and they trust you, then that's how I usually solve that.
Yeah, it certainly helps to create like a ticket for it. It's like, hey, everything you just said, I got
Mm-hmm.
a ticket right here. I've assigned it to myself, as a way to show up. I'm not just promising. I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
just
Okay.
drop off the
You've
map.
got a ticket culture.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, that's just my first thought is like sometimes imagine this DTO object you're talking about, nothing's using it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're trying to get this in, and then someone's like, well, what's the use of getting this in because there's not a working feature here, and you're like, well, it's breaking it into tiny pieces. So we don't lose the work in the future. And then I could see some very pedantic people going, well, if we're switching priorities, you might be merging something we never end up using for years, and now it's just other code that might confuse somebody when they come along. And you're like,
That's true.
well, I mean, we want to deliver things iteratively, so we have to put them in tiny pieces. So either I confuse somebody for a little bit, then we clean it up in the future, or we risk a massive PR that code rots or never gets
Mm-hmm.
in anyway, or we have some other issues. And I feel like someone could make the argument for both, but I still like the iterative approach. And if they wanted to, we could at least track all the stories of things we put in there, and if we decide to switch priorities, we can go in and revert those PRs or something.
Well, this is where code comments are especially helpful. Like if you put in what this thing is and what it's for,
Yeah.
instead of just, "Oh, well, here's a DTO object and it relates to this table and it's got these calls." Like,
Yeah.
that's not a helpful comment. But if you say this is part of this and it's used this way,
If nothing uses this by March 13th, 2025, please delete this code.
yeah,
Don't
that
be
you can do
confused by
that.
this. Something like that.
I, in my job, I spent a day trying to understand how this piece of code worked, and then I finally came to the conclusion that it's not wired in, and that I'm
Yeah.
looking at a red herring that from 2020, from 2020.
Exactly. And that's their argument. Like they're going to look at this and go, why is this in here? I spent 3 hours trying to figure out where this was used until I realized, oh, you wasted my time. There's
That
always an
life is
argument one way or the other.
imperfect.
Yeah,
I've
totally.
I've spent a lot of time looking at code that got rewritten,
Hmm.
and nobody did the final cleanup and removed the original version, and so I was looking at the legacy version, which was no longer
Yeah,
used, but it was still there. Right? Maintenance is maintenance.
right. All right, so let's go back to this point then, the how to switch gears then. So
Yeah.
let's say that you put people on your side and you say, okay, we want to change our culture such that we have some features that get in at a more iterative cycle, and we're going to try to
Okay.
push them in this way. How do you swap work from them?
Well, it becomes less mentally uh, upsetting, because I find when there's a shift, it's not that people are like, it's not that people don't understand that there's been a shift or that they disagree with the change in priorities. I mean, sometimes they do, but usually, if your boss says, "Hey, there's this great opportunity over here," or there's some legal regulatory change, or we
Hmm.
screwed up something and we really need to do it, right? Like we're in the US only, and our European customers are really mad because of GDPR,
Right.
and we need to drop everything and build out a data center, cloud data center in Europe. Okay, like the people will understand it intellectually, but they'll still be upset. They will still be
Right.
thinking about all that work in progress.
Yeah. This gets me a lot too because I it's hard for me to put down work, especially if it's like a really
Mm-hmm.
fun problem to solve. And the idea that we're like 70% through and then I just have to pause for a bit. That sucks. Yeah, that context swapping is not very fun. And it's so hard not to obsess over it for me, for sure.
Well, when you're 70% through, which 70% are you through? Because with me, I'm very good at keeping the value top of mind, and
Hmm.
so I hone in directly on the value, and then I come back and I flesh it out, productionize it. And so if I'm 70% of the way through, I've probably already delivered a minimum viable thing to get the value,
Hmm.
right? And I haven't come back and got all the edge cases and smoothed it out, but like to me, by that point, the value is there, and if the potential value is there.
Let me put it
And
to you this way then.
yeah.
There's some particular product we plan on releasing soon that's feature flagged. It's not quite
Mm-hmm.
done, and I'm excited about it. And then we decide to change and swap and say we're not going to release this as a product decision, even if it's feature flagged for few more months. So it's more about the product getting released than the actual code completion of it. So just
Ah,
switching gears that way is really what I'm getting at. And 70% is just some arbitrary number. I'm just saying in
sure.
general, when I'm midway through, it's hard to swap gears for me.
Yes. Well, I'll go even one more. Right? It's feature complete,
Hmm.
and then we decide not to release the product. Right? We had a plan, we had a theory, we were going to build this product, it was going to make money, and then you've invested all the time
Yeah.
and effort, and then like, you know what? We were wrong. It's not going to pay off. We're just going to stop. We're not going to release this thing, and that
Yeah.
sucks. There are famously in finance, there are famous examples where they would run two teams, and whichever team finished first, that's the one that they would go with for like a feature, and the other team they just throw the work away and say, "Okay, you came in second, so here's the new project."
Whoa. That's a weird way to. Very competitive.
It's competitive. It also goes to this thing called soft dollars, which wild tangent finance. People who are in finance are nodding their heads with the insanity
Hmm.
that is soft. It's about credits for. It, there's a when you're providing banking services, soft dollars are these credits that you are statute. There's a statute that says you have to give them this many credits as part of the advice fees that go to pay for advice fees, and you get these companies that are racking up millions and millions of dollars in these credits, and they don't really want your financial advice,
Hmm.
so you give them programmers, so you give them programming hours, so it doesn't cost them anything to have two teams.
Oh, interesting.
It's a whole wild
Yeah.
thing. Anyway,
But even still, putting two teams against each other to deliver one project, it seems like one team would just call theirs finished faster, but maybe it is not as good because they're rushing to beat another team and they're not going for
yes.
quality. They're just going to win. They just have a worse experience overall.
Well, it's
Worse
finance,
product.
so
Yeah.
it's all proofs in the pudding,
Hmm. Guess
right?
so.
If you release an inferior product, uh, it's going to cost your customer a lot of money,
Yeah.
and they're going to
Terrifying.
notice.
Terrifying to know all these finance companies are working in these weird ways,
It's
or at least
it's
some of them.
yeah. The whole show could become about finance and the
Sure.
madness that is finance. Uh, but putting the work down, right? It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to get it out of your head. It's super hard to get it out of your head when it's done or mostly done, and the whatever changed, and
Hmm.
so you're not going to release it. And the only thing I can offer you there is smaller, faster chunks, right? Get less, a more minimum product out quicker cuts your risk.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
But it still sucks. When
Yeah,
it
but
happens
at
to you,
least
it
your work's
sucks.
not lost. Even if
Right.
even if part of your project was restructuring some of your code such that you could expand a feature, if you got that work
Mm-hmm.
done first to restructure the code and write better tests and clean up some code, you've got that in the system, and then you can, maybe not turn on the new thing or still pivot, but like you said, if you're delivering in smaller chunks, you're still not losing the value. That's the main, I feel like the main thread, because we've talked about this in other episodes, but just
Mm-hmm.
about how this is just de-risking in general. Like if you want to keep most of your value in hours worked, working in small chunks, that can be merged back in to main as soon as possible, so the work
Yeah.
isn't lost. Is your best bet, and the longer you keep some new thing outside of the main code base, the riskier it becomes to merge it back in, whether it's through like dealing with all the merge conflicts or changes over time, or um, some other new thing popping up, and then the code just kind of dies because you're distracted, and suddenly it's a year old, you
Yeah.
know, and too
Well,
much has changed.
remember,
Yeah.
risk is the probability over time. So the more time you have, the more risky something becomes. Always. Like there is no increased time without increasing risk. And
I
so
guess I never thought of
just
it that way, but all right, I'll take that.
just cutting the time cuts risk. It's not the only way to cut risk, but cutting time will always cut risk.
What about in the case of, so okay, let me pitch this to you and see if the time thing still works.
Okay.
We were considering reworking how taxes were calculated on a product.
Mm-hmm.
We did a huge deep dive into it, and the way taxes were set up for people, it was just really complicated for the user, and they didn't really understand it. And then through some nice discussions with customers and with product and understanding the service, we found a better way to restructure both taxes internally, like how they're saved for local versus state and whatever, blah blah blah, and display it to the user, and just to simplify the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we did some work on it. However, there was concern because of the historical lack of trust in the product. Even though everything looked good, everyone wants to cut it anywhere, like pause it anyway, because it's like we'd rather not release it now, even though it's ready, because we're scared that if there is a bug, this could be the last straw for some people.
Mm.
So we're gonna not we're gonna add time to it. We're gonna let people. We're gonna build trust to de-risk it in that sense. So it's a weirder case, but we'd rather
Yeah.
not release it early just in case. Just let's
But then when you
it,
do
you know
release it, it's more risky. So
yeah
you're weighing the a small bug versus a giant bug, unless you're literally putting the project on ice and it's not
yeah.
increasing in size.
There's just that additional context of
Yeah.
everybody being like, hey, one more thing happens here, I'm done. And she's like, well, now I'm scared to release because everything looks good. But we've got this other bit of pressure that is a little outside of just like, okay, we can't mess up anymore.
Yeah.
Customer's already mad. But it's just kind of a fun, there's almost an it
Yes.
depends for everything.
There's always an it depends.
Yeah.
I think it's a good place to leave it. How do you put aside? Uh, how do you put work down when your priorities change? It depends.
It depends. Well, you put it down carefully. You
Carefully.
get as much of the work as you can in over time so that you're not too attached to losing everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then that if you do have to pick it back up, it's a small chunk of work because most of it's already been delivered. So iteratively is
Yeah.
how you put work down.
Iteratively. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.